Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Weinhofer from Firaxis Games. I'm very excited to be here today, coming all the way from the United States. It's really great to be here in Hyderabad at IGDC. I hope everyone's really excited for an awesome conference. I will be speaking to you today about designing our tactical combat for Marvel's Midnight Suns and our journey from soldiers to superheroes. All right, let's kick it off with a quick outline of the talk. I'll start with a quick intro for myself and my career history, then go into the origin story of how Marvel's Midnight Suns came to exist and give some initial design context and background. We'll then get into the main part of the talk, which is diving deep into the evolution of our tactical combat design across three primary areas: our card-based ability system, positioning and movement for our characters, and the management of tactical resources. I'll be calling out key takeaways throughout the talk, but we'll summarize everything at the end and tie it all together. Oh, there we go. I was like, I should be clicking during this slide. There we go. There's the full outline. OK, first up, quick intro for me. I joined Firaxis towards the end of 2014 as my first job in the game industry, and have been working there ever since, so going on almost 9 years now. For those who don't know, Firaxis Games is located in Hunt Valley, Maryland, in the United States, about 30 minutes north of the city of Baltimore, and as a studio is entirely dedicated to making strategy games. We were founded in 1996 by legendary designer Sid Meier, creator of Civilization and the affectionately titled Godfather of strategy games. Can't have a Firaxis GDC talk without mentioning Sid, so there he is. Hey, Sid. Firaxis is known for some of the most popular franchises in the strategy genre, including Civilization, XCOM, and now Marvel's Midnight Suns. I was hired at Firaxis as a gameplay engineer to work on XCOM 2. My background is actually more in programming than in design. I helped to implement most of the functionality on the strategy layer in the game, including the facilities, staffing system, and research projects. When we began working on War of the Chosen, the expansion to XCOM 2, I started taking on more design responsibilities. Firaxis has always curated a fusion of gameplay engineer and designer, since that's how Sid works. And we found that combination to be really valuable for rapid iteration and prototyping, since if I have a change that I want to see in the game or try out something new, I can program it myself, test things out without needing to bother the engineering team. It's a unique mix, but it's kind of worked for us over the years. By the end of War of the Chosen, I had helped to lead the design of a few key features, such as the Templar soldier class, the covert action system, expanding the soldier ability trees and how their progression worked, and was very involved in the overall playtesting design and balance for shipping that product. After War of the Chosen, I was very lucky to be given the opportunity to work as the lead designer on Marvel's Midnight Suns. I worked very closely with our creative director, Jake Solomon, and the rest of the design team to ensure that all of the pieces of the game fit together. I essentially became the person with an encyclopedic knowledge of how everything in the game works or was supposed to work, and then helped to move the team towards fulfilling that vision. And currently, I am the game director on an unannounced project. OK, here we go. Let's get started with the Midnight Suns origin story. But like most stories, we need a bit of setup and context from a prologue. And for us, that is going to be XCOM. So what is XCOM? It's short for extraterrestrial combat. XCOM is a turn-based tactical strategy game where you, the player, are the commander of a top-secret special organization operation which represents humanity's last line of defense against an alien invasion. XCOM's structure as a game is divided into two different layers. Combat missions play out with you controlling a squad of randomly generated and highly customizable soldiers on a tile grid. And then there is a meta strategy layer back at the XCOM HQ where you promote your soldiers, choose how to expand your base and its capabilities, manage resources and staff, and choose where in the world you're going to deploy next for your next combat mission. XCOM is a tense game. The player is expected to feel like an underdog, always on the back foot, tasked with overcoming a terrifyingly superior and advanced foe. And many of our gameplay mechanics intentionally reflect this tension. A few of them are permadeath. If your soldiers are killed in combat, that's it. They are gone forever, can't get them back. We also have Fog of War, which hides most of the battlefield until you move a soldier close to reveal those tiles. Unknown alien forces are lurking around inside, waiting to pop out and ruin your day. In XCOM 2, we also added concealment as a temporary stealth mechanic, which encouraged players to be even more cautious with every move. And hell, even our research for scientific progress is pretty grim. You literally have to autopsy alien corpses to make technological advances and learn how to build more powerful weapons and gear. But hey, that's XCOM, baby. We'll go a bit deeper into XCOM's combat in a few minutes, but if you're curious to learn more about how it works and the design behind it, my coworker, Mark Nauta, gave an excellent talk here at GDC last year titled Designing Systems for Strategy Games, which focuses entirely on XCOM and how its design lessons can be applied more broadly across the strategy genre. It's up on YouTube. It's a really, really fantastic talk. I highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. Go check it out. OK, so now that we have some background on XCOM, what about Midnight Suns? Let's start with the high-level marketing pitch, in case anyone isn't familiar with the game. Marvel's Midnight Suns is a massive new tactical RPG which unleashes the darker side of Marvel, featuring a brand new Marvel superhero created as a collaboration between Firaxis Games and Marvel, and a new story which explores the untapped vein of supernatural and mystical forces in the Marvel universe. As the Hunter, a supernatural warrior with a mysterious past, you will lead a team of dangerous and conflicted heroes from across Marvel's hero families. With hundreds of combinations of upgradable characters and skills and the ability to customize your own unique version of the Hunter, you will choose how to send Lilith, the mother of demons, and her army of Lilin back to hell. It's pretty cool, right? It's like, hell yeah, I'd play that game. Also, quick shout out to Lilith for being the video game villainess of the year. OK, so marketing pitch aside, Midnight Suns has some pretty key similarities to XCOM. It's still a squad-based strategy tactics game, and it maintains the divide between the combat and strategic layers. However, it also has many, many differences. Midnight Suns moves much more towards the RPG-style mechanics with a roster of 13 unique playable heroes, up to 17 with the DLC, and using cards as the representation for our ability system. Midnight Suns also only allows you to bring 3 heroes into combat missions for the entire game, whereas XCOM allows the squad size to grow from 4 soldiers at the start up to 6. Midnight Suns has a full friendship system for the Hunter to bond with each of the other Marvel superheroes, and a full dialogue system where your choices can affect those relationships. There's also a fully navigable hero base called the Abbey, which you can run around in and explore as the Hunter in third-person camera view, along with discovering mysteries and secrets in the extensive Abbey grounds. Overall, the game feels like a huge mashup of a lot of different genres. It's got tactics, strategy, RPG elements, exploration, life sim, even a bit of dating game elements. It's a lot. It's a really big game. So how did this happen? How did we end up going from soldiers with XCOM to superheroes with Midnight Suns? Hey, that's the name of this talk. Well, long story short, Marvel approached us. The team over at Marvel Games loves XCOM and asked if we would be interested in making a turn-based tactics Marvel game using their superheroes. So Firaxis is filled with hardcore Marvel fans, myself included, so the chance to work on a new Marvel game was literally a dream come true. Obviously, we said yes and got to work. So our first big question. We've just been asked by Marvel, one of the biggest, most popular IPs across the world, to make a new tactics game using their characters. Where do we start? Well, we stuck with what we knew, which was XCOM. Our first thought was to do a very similar design to XCOM, but we'll swap out XCOM soldiers with S.H.I.E.L.D. agents from the Marvel Universe. S.H.I.E.L.D. is literally a top-secret super spy organization. That's pretty similar to XCOM, right? And then superheroes like Iron Man or Wolverine, they can show up as guest appearances for those really big moments in the story. That'll feel super cool. OK, easy. That should be no problem. We'll just use shield agents as our soldiers and have the heroes pop in, and that's it, no problem. Except we quickly realized that we, as fans, really wanted to play as the heroes. We didn't just want Spider-Man to show up once every 3 or 4 hours. I want to see him all the time. Now, I've got nothing against Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., they're great, but as fans, when we read comic books, watch the MCU, play superhero video games, fantasize about having superpowers, it's because of the heroes. It really feels like they should be the focus and the heart of this new game. Keeping that goal in mind led us to establish our core foundational pillar for the entirety of Marvel's Midnight Suns: feel heroic. We want you, as the player, to feel like a superhero in nearly every moment of the game, and this should drive all of the decisions that we make about what to put into the game and how our systems and our design should function. And that brings us to our first takeaway from this talk. Identify the core. This can be hard, difficult, even emotional work. But take the time to think deeply about whatever it is you want the core of your game to be and identify it, name it, write it down, and share it with your team. It doesn't need to be just one single pillar or statement. You can have multiple and varying ones for different areas of the game if it makes sense. But identifying these cores is incredibly critical to establish early on in your project, as it gives you this North Star guidepost around which you can then focus all of your ideas. It forces you to distill down to the core essence of what you want your game to be. If you propose a new feature or a design change and it doesn't feel like it really resonates with that core, well then maybe that's a sign that that's not the right fit for your game and you need to try something else. All right, we've established our core. We know we're making a hero-focused Marvel strategy game. But before we go further down the design road, I get asked a lot if Marvel told us exactly what characters we could use, what story we should tell, and how much creative freedom did we actually have in making decisions about the game. In short, the relationship between Firaxis and Marvel Games was fantastic. They really didn't dictate anything for us in terms of character choices or the story. We had nearly complete creative freedom to tell the story that we wanted using their characters and their world. We had to stay true to the essence of each character, of course. We can't change who they fundamentally are as a person or their powers or their personality. Like we couldn't make Captain America into an asshole or turn Blade into a werewolf instead of a vampire. But otherwise, we were good to go. To Marvel's credit, when we came to them saying that we wanted to use the very metal, full of hellfire and brimstone and demons, Rise of the Midnight Suns supernatural story arc from the 90s, and also, while we're at it, create our own brand new customizable superhero, they were fully on board. They kind of looked at us like we were insane, or like, you sure you guys want to do all of that? But then they were like, yes, that sounds awesome and amazing. Absolutely, let's do it. And they were with us every step of the way to make it happen. OK, here we go. On to tactical combat design. We'll go into 3 different areas of focus here, starting first with our decision to use cards to represent our hero abilities. To explain how we ended up with this card system in Midnight Suns, we first need to go a bit deeper on XCOM's combat design for some other for additional context on where we came from. As I mentioned earlier, XCOM is really meant to feel stressful to play because it's all about going up against this technologically advanced foe who is superior to you in every possible sense of the word. Similar to the overall game mechanics, as we discussed before, like permadeath, the specific combat systems in XCOM are also designed to provide that tension. Let's take a look at a few of them. First, and probably the biggest overall impact, is that in XCOM, your abilities, your shots are not guaranteed to hit. There's always a percentage hit chance to succeed with your attacks. Nothing is guaranteed. This gives you a big risk and reward feeling with each shot, and you need to plan to maximize your chances of dealing damage. You can make a plan, but you are always on your toes and needing to respond when things don't go the way that you predicted or may have hoped. This can lead to some really fantastic moments where you take a chance, a low percentage hit chance shot against a really powerful enemy and end up taking them out. But it can also be really frustrating when you miss a 95% shot against an alien that is standing literally right next to your soldier. Next, soldiers in XCOM have a limited movement range. Combat takes place on a grid, and each soldier can only move so many tiles per turn. Now, this is a pretty common limitation in turn-based tactics games, but it leads into that feeling of being restricted, of being inferior to your enemies. Since you are not able to always move to an optimal location, you may have to settle for something that's more risky. And finally, soldiers need to take cover to defend against enemy attacks. If your soldiers are moved to a location that doesn't provide those defensive cover bonuses, they're going to have a very bad time. You pretty much have to do this in order to kind of play the game successfully. It's baked into the rules. When you go to move a soldier, you're really looking just for those best cover locations, looking for the most defensible position you can take while also maximizing your chances to hit against an enemy. All of these things combined leads to a very kind of cat and mouse, back and forth feeling to the game as you move your soldiers into cover, kind of watch them hide, crouch. They're going to peek out, take their shots, duck back in. You hope and pray that their shots hit, and you do that for every soldier, every turn. It's stressful. It adds up. It's a lot of decision making. So what happens if we take these tension-building mechanics, but instead of controlling a squad of soldiers, you're controlling a team of superheroes? Well, it kind of sucks. These mechanics all completely fight with the power fantasy of being a superhero. It's like, are you going to tell me I'm a hero like the Hulk, but I have a limited movement range, my giant Hulk smash punches are sometimes going to miss their target, and I have to take cover and hide from puny enemies? It's like, no way, come on, that doesn't make any sense. So for our first prototype, we started with the XCOM game systems, but we took out all of those tension-building mechanics, just simply removed them all. We took out the grid, we gave heroes unlimited movement range, removed taking cover, and heroes always have a 100% chance to land all of their attacks. Using XCOM as a foundation was a really fantastic headspace to put ourselves in to get started. But when we played with our feel heroic core pillar in mind, it was clear that these mechanics weren't going to work for superheroes. It was at this point where we really needed to sit down and think hard about what we were committing to and say, oh, OK, XCOM rules just aren't going to cut it for this superhero game. We pretty much need to design an entire new tactical combat rule set to make this work. I guess that's what we're doing now, so here we go. We knew that this was going to be risky. We had just removed essentially all of the mechanics which make XCOM an actually interesting tactics game. And we'll spend pretty much the rest of this talk figuring out and going through the steps of how we built up those tactical elements again while maintaining that feel heroic core. To start, we needed to really reevaluate and rework our foundational primary combat game loops to shift away from the XCOM rules and have it better fit combat for superheroes. So as a quick aside, what do I mean when I say game loops? All games are constructed out of a series of loops, which players experience over and over again as part of the game's structure and mechanics. It's useful to think of your game in terms of small, medium, and long-term loops, and these can change across different game areas. For example, in Midnight Suns, the largest possible game loop is just the full game, a complete playthrough from start to finish, tutorial to finale. The medium loop is going from the Abbey base into a combat mission, back to the Abbey base, back into another combat mission, and so on and so forth. And the smallest loop at this scale is the combat missions themselves. Within a combat mission, those loops change. Your biggest loop is now just the entire scope of the combat mission from start to finish, whether you succeed or fail. The medium loop is the turn or round structure, so alternating between hero turn, enemy turn, back to the hero turn. And the smallest loop is within a single hero turn taking specific individual actions. The smallest loop is what we really need to focus on and ensure that it feels great, since it's the thing that your players will do over and over and over and over again. Think of pressing a button to make Mario jump, or holding down a trigger to fire a weapon in your favorite first-person shooter. If that core action does not feel satisfying, it's really hard to build the rest of a game on top of it, because it is the foundation on which all of your other game actions will follow. OK, back to our prototype for Midnight Suns. After taking out the XCOM rules, we now have a really simple game. Heroes have a set of abilities which can deal damage every turn. They can move wherever they want, they don't take cover, and all of their attacks hit. The game is fun in the sense that it feels good to consistently stomp enemies, and it feels heroic to not have the restrictions that we removed. So that's great. That validates our choice to remove those XCOM mechanics. I can select an ability, pick a target, and watch Captain America run across the screen to punch a goon in the face. I don't need to separately choose where to move. I can just pick the target and go. He is off and running. That simple sequence of inputs, player actions, and results feels slick and satisfying. Doing that multiple times in a row, experiencing that smallest loop of picking the ability, pick a target, and see it execute, it feels like we could build something off of that. And this brings us to our second takeaway. Start with simple loops. Distill them down to that simplest possible meaningful and smallest actions within your game, and make them match the feeling of your core pillar. Make the thing that you are going to be doing, or your players are going to be doing, 1,000,000 times over the course of the game fun, and ensure that it resonates with you, with that core, and that it feels positive and exciting. Do this, importantly, before you introduce any additional rules, mechanics, or complexity. If the most basic loops and actions in your game aren't engaging in their simplest form, it's unlikely that making the game more complicated will fix that. So start simple. OK, we now have the essence of our smallest feel heroic game loop established. That's great. But there isn't any challenge here. This prototype is kind of boring. We distilled the game down by removing the mechanics which didn't fit our core pillar, but there isn't much interest in the actual game here to keep me playing. There's no tactics. There's no real substance. And again, this is fine at this point. This is kind of what we expected and what we were working towards. But now that we've identified those simplest core loops, we can start making the game more complex again to bring back that level of tactical challenge. On to version 2 of the prototype, where we try to make this a strategy game again. Unsurprisingly, as XCOM designers, our first thought was, hey, we don't have any randomness in this game. We need something which will make the game feel less predictable, keep us on our toes, force us to reevaluate our options so we can't perfectly execute on every turn every time we play. Chance to Hit does this in XCOM. The element of randomness baked into every action you take, determining whether you hit a shot or succeed in an ability, that's a big element of what makes XCOM interesting, fun, and challenging. It may be frustrating at times, sure, when you miss a shot, but it forces you to then think on your feet, react, respond, and adapt to a changing battlefield. It's a huge part of what makes combat not feel predictable and boring. So let's bring some randomness back for Midnight Suns. The main type of randomness we introduced for the prototype at this point was called counter. Counter is a percentage chance for an enemy to counterattack a hero. You can see it highlighted in the screenshot. It's the red bar under the enemy's health. When an enemy is attacked, if they succeed at their RNG roll to counter, that ends the attacking hero's turn. And if the enemy doesn't counter, their chance to counter the next hero attack increases. So heroes can keep attacking enemies over and over again until they are either countered or all the enemies are knocked out and you win. We tried many permutations of this mechanic. What happens if a hero could be countered more than once before their turn is ended? How does the enemy counter chance increase with each hero attack? Does counter chance change based on the ability which the hero used? On and on, we tried lots of different combinations of these rules. You can probably guess, out of all the permutations that we tried, there were some pretty big problems with this approach. After the counter chance on an enemy becomes high enough, you as a player don't want to attack that enemy anymore, since you know it's very likely that it will end your hero's turn. It's a weird incentive. The game has told you it's good to attack enemies. You need to KO them all to win the game and to finish the mission. But then it's also telling you at the same time, don't attack that enemy or your turn is going to end. This tension is pretty bad. It encourages and puts pressure on the player to take an action which they strongly believe will result in a negative outcome, but the game is telling you or implying to you that it's a good thing. It basically feels like the game is kind of lying to you. This is opposite to the XCOM experience with Chance to Hit, where the player is encouraged to take chances and hope for a positive outcome. One clear symptom of this tension that we saw in the prototype is that getting unlucky feels really bad. If an enemy has a low chance to counter, but they succeed and it triggers on the first attack that your hero goes to make, it's like, that's the end of the hero's turn. That's it. No cool combo streaks. You're just like one and done. And it feels terrible because you don't feel heroic. So we now have this mechanic which provides a lot of randomness, and it's in very surprising, unpredictable bursts. But the rest of the time in the prototype, there isn't that much variety. You would pick the strongest attack with each hero every turn and just do that over and over again and hope for the best. Neither one of these moments feels good. You couldn't really plan or strategize other than just targeting the enemy with the lowest counter chance with the strongest hero and try to stay active as long as possible. The game wasn't really unpredictable, which made it kind of boring, but there was also this high degree of surprise, so you couldn't actually plan. You didn't have any tactics that you could really use. In a tactics game, surprising the player is generally not something that we want to do, at least not frequently, because it disrupts that ability to plan and to be strategic and to feel smart. Sure, it can be fun to have occasional surprises to mix things up and force a player to adapt, but when surprise is built into the core rules in such a fundamental way, that's not great. The level of surprise in XCOM felt pretty good generally. The actions you have available every turn were very predictable, so that was an area of low variance, turn over turn, but the outcomes on using those abilities from our Chance to Hit gave us randomness each turn with a higher variance. And occasionally you would have those moments of surprise when a new enemy appears for the first time and you don't know what they're going to do. For Midnight Suns, we really needed to take this back to our core pillar and say, what is the player experience that we want from combat in this situation? What is going to help us feel heroic? Having this much surprise didn't feel like it was satisfying that for us. It wasn't lining up with our pillar because the player didn't feel smart, and it's hard to feel like a hero if the game doesn't let you make a plan. We already knew that we wanted to have predictable outcomes in Midnight Suns with low variance. So we thought, well, what happens if we take this huge element of surprise and, I don't know, kind of flip this on its head? Could we make a system where we instead move that surprise, that level of randomness, to the actions which you have available? Okay, that's interesting. So you're telling me we want a randomized set of abilities that have a predictable set of outcomes. That sounds kind of familiar. Right, of course. Card games do this. This is how most card games work. You get dealt a hand of cards every turn, which is a random set of abilities, but each ability, each card, can have a defined rule or defined outcome. Cards also have lots of other benefits when you use them in a game. They give you concepts which are broadly understood by the general public, like a deck, drawing, discard, and a hand, all for free. For example, if I say, you have a deck of 60 cards and you draw 7 at the start of your turn, that's all generally something that we all understand. They're relatively ubiquitous as game mechanics. You don't have to tutorialize them much to your players. And those concepts can then be more easily manipulated and changed with other game rules or systems because that underlying set is so familiar. Cards are also really fantastic as individual elements which can encapsulate gameplay. There's a reason board games have been using them forever. You can get a lot of information from a single card, sometimes too much. Icons, numbers, keywords can all fit on a card and convey a lot of gameplay information in a consistent, isolated format. We're big fans of card games at Firaxis, and the Midnight Suns team took a lot of inspiration from them. I'm pretty sure we were all playing Slay the Spire towards the start of development, so it's not really a surprise that cards came up as a mechanic we wanted to try. Slay the Spire, playing cards feels really dynamic and powerful and fast, and we wanted to take that and try to see if we could emulate it with Midnight Suns. So we shifted our hero abilities over to cards. Every turn, you would draw a random set of abilities for each hero. This introduced a more controlled sense of randomness. We also took out the counter mechanic on enemies, so that was bad. So the randomness was more contained in only this single area of card draw. And it worked. It felt so much better. Compared to the previous versions of the prototype, the availability of player actions every turn is now unpredictable, but the outcomes of each of those actions is defined on the cards. And there aren't that many bursts of surprise. We're back to a similar level of surprise from XCOM, where it's just when new enemies show up or a boss shows up for the first time. This feels great for superheroes. If Captain America can punch the guy because I have the Captain America punch card in my hand, and I play that and have Cap do that action, then he will always succeed in punching that guy in the face. Also, players now have the opportunity to plan again. You can analyze the board state, you can look at the abilities that you have in your hand, and have a clear understanding and expectation of what a sequence of actions that you take is going to do on any given turn. Turn to turn is now also way less repetitive, since you have uncertainty in what cards you're going to draw at the start of the turn, which will inform the abilities that you can do. It's also worth noting that this level of certainty wouldn't work in XCOM. In XCOM, what you can do each turn is consistent, but the outcomes of those abilities are unpredictable, which matches the struggle, the tension that's inherent in that game. In Midnight Suns, the superheroes always succeeding in their actions is critical to feel heroic. So we randomize what they can do each turn instead. So is it odd that we have cards in a tactical superhero game? Yeah, absolutely. We knew this would be a controversial choice, and that reception and first impressions of this would be mixed. We certainly have had plenty of people look at the game and go, oh, this has cards in it? All right, that's not for me. But was it the right fit for this game and for our design goals? Yes, absolutely. Using the predictable outcomes and the gameplay encapsulation with cards gave us exactly the feeling that we wanted of being heroic in combat, while still giving us enough randomness turn over turn for strategic planning and a large enough gameplay design space to create interesting abilities for every individual hero. So the takeaway here is, if you need to step outside the comfort zone of your genre, or think outside the box with some design ideas, but they are rooted in your core pillar and your simple loops, and you feel it is 100% the right fit for your game, go for it. It will make your game stand out, feel unique, and you will feel like you are sticking true to your vision. OK, and that's how we ended up with cards in Midnight Suns. We're only about partway through our design journey here and building up the full set of tactical combat mechanics, so let's keep going and move on to discuss positioning and movement. Looking back at our initial prototype goals and the changes from XCOM, you'll remember that we took out the grid and tile-based gameplay. We allow heroes to move wherever they want, and there are no cover locations. Taking these out definitely felt correct to feel heroic, but it had the consequence of removing a big area of decision-making and strategic planning. Where am I going to move this character? Is there a safe location for them? Is that spot going to give me a good attack on the enemy or not? We wanted to bring some of this complexity back into the level for Midnight Suns. We don't want players only looking at their hand of cards to figure out what they want to do each turn. We want them looking at the actual battlefield as well. There should be interesting things for heroes to do using the map. Now, early in your development cycle, when you're prototyping like this, it's the ideal time for research, ideation, finding just cool things and putting them in the game to see if they're fun, try things out. So from reading comics, watching Marvel TV shows and movies, we had a pretty good understanding of how superheroes fight and what they do in battle that feels cool and exciting and heroic. So there were two big ideas that we wanted to try out in this space of putting things into the environment. The first is heroes throwing enemies around in combat. You know, punch a guy and watch him go flying across the room, or pick someone up and throw them. We called this system knockback in the way that we implemented it. Knockback in Midnight Suns is a modifier on an attack ability which allows a hero to push an enemy in a specific direction. The player has control over the direction that the enemy goes, so you can choose to throw them into an obstacle, over a ledge, or into another enemy, or even another hero. When an enemy is knocked back and impacts with something else, they'll take additional damage. So it's always useful to manipulate enemies to knock them back into stuff. Especially if you collide enemies into one another, then they'll both take damage. Most of the knockback abilities in the game have a limited angle where you can send enemies based on the approach of the hero, roughly a 90-degree cone you can see in this video. The position of heroes matters then to set up those angles like a pool or a billiards shot and knock back the enemy where you want them to go. The second big idea that we wanted to try for putting gameplay into the levels is to see heroes directly interacting with the environment. They're always destroying things, picking up objects, ripping off a car door to either use it as a shield or throw it at somebody. These ideas became environment attacks. Environment attacks involve a hero using an object in the world to trigger an ability. Some of these require some positioning as well, such as vaulting off of a car onto an enemy or sliding a giant crate into a group of foes. Heroes use their momentum and their relative position of the object they are interacting with to trigger the attack from a specific angle. Taken together, both environment attacks and knockback are a deeper level of strategic planning and combat, since you can first knock back an enemy to get them in range of an environment attack or vice versa. A decent amount of the decision space in tactical combat ends up focusing on who is getting knocked back where, what environment object can be used, and in what order are you doing all of these things. So how do heroes actually get into the correct position to set up those angles and use those cool abilities and manipulate the enemies? Well, they can move. Heroes will generally always need to move when they use an ability. You either need to get close to your enemy for a melee attack or to get into line of sight for a ranged attack. Can't shoot through walls, even for superheroes. In XCOM, you would need to explicitly move a soldier to a spot where those attacks could be performed. If you couldn't move, you couldn't do the ability. But in Midnight Suns, we had removed that movement and positioning requirement entirely. Remember our simplest core game loop. You can just pick a target, or select your hero or ability, pick a target, and they're off and running. They will move automatically wherever they need to go on the battlefield. The game repositions anyone that's in the way so that the ability just works. It keeps that core, smallest action as simple as possible. But, as you might imagine, this level of simplicity and flexibility has some complications. On a grid system like XCOM, we can set very specific rules, like only one unit can be in a single tile at the same time. In Midnight Suns, the grid didn't exist, so enemies could collide with one another, clip through each other, run through them, etc. It was kind of a mess when we first put this in. It also gave us a lot of pretty difficult questions to answer, such as, well, what happens if you try to knock back an enemy who has their back to a wall? Where do they go? Where do they go when they bounce off of the wall? Do they collide again with the hero? What happens if I vault off of a car, but there's no room for the hero to land there? Where do the rest of the characters go if they're already standing next to the car? What if there is a wall of enemies in front of me, and the hero has to move through them to reach their target? Where do they go? So these are all situations we needed to eventually resolve and think about how to handle within our movement system. You can see in this screenshot, where does Blade land after vaulting off of this object? He could collide with the hunter or any of the other enemies. Needless to say, our engineering team was not happy with us when we presented all of these problems and said, hey, we need to find solutions to this. Aside from the technical challenges, the movement system also introduced this odd conflict in our system designs. The auto movement system for abilities says to the player, you don't need to care about positioning. Just use your abilities, pick the targets that you want. We'll take care of everything else. Your heroes, enemies, everybody will just move automatically. But then we have mechanics like knockback and environment attacks, which do care about positioning. You need to be in this spot to line up your attack, get the right angle to hit this enemy. Uh-oh, that feels like a pretty major problem. How are we going to fix this? After thinking about it and looking at this problem for a while, we started to ask ourselves instead, well, do we actually need to fix this? All three of these systems, movement, knockback, and environment attacks, feel really exciting to us as players, and they're satisfying our core goal of feeling heroic. And we know we want to maintain that core user experience, that simplest game loop of pick a target and then boom, the hero is off and running, no other micromanagement of locations and positioning. So can we work around this? What happens if we let all three of these systems exist? Can we live with this tension? We came up with a few solutions and ideas here. The first was to acknowledge that this tension exists. There is tension between these systems, but we're going to commit to living with them unless it becomes absolutely critical and detrimental to the gameplay experience if we keep them all in. If we need to, we could remove knockback or take out environment attacks or increase the number of moves available to heroes every turn. There are some pull in case of emergency levers here if we need them. But first, let's try to mitigate the friction between these systems as much as possible. We first added Move as a separate ability, which the player can use once per turn. This gives players a way to directly control positioning when they really want to line up that angle for a perfect, precise attack. It also introduces another resource in Tactical, which is great as an added benefit, since that's now something valuable which we can manipulate with our other hero abilities. Spider-Man, for example, has abilities which give the team extra bonus moves. We'll talk more about the other tactical resources in a few minutes. Momentum was an eventual key addition to the Move ability, which lets you continue moving with a hero until you perform some other action. If you are trying to line up a perfect knockback or environment attack angle, you can reposition as much as you need to make sure the angle is just right before you commit to the ability. This also helps to prevent misclicks. We also added a highlight to the world, which shows where the hero is going to end up after using an ability. It's the green marker that you can see as I move between the different targets. This helped to convey the information about where the character is going to end up for the players who really, really wanted that level of detail and planning. It was definitely going to become useful at the highest difficulty levels. And finally, we set our engineering team to work on building what we call the Move Out of the Way system to ensure that players always feel like the game is making decisions in their favor whenever another unit on the map is automatically moved around, to the point where this isn't something that you should notice at all and it just fades into the background. Our engineers really did a phenomenal job setting this up so that the enemies smoothly sidestep to allow another character to run past them on the way to their target, and to ensure that characters don't end up colliding with one another after performing abilities. It was really successful, and it's a credit to their hard work that when you're playing the game, it's not something that you really notice or need to think about. You can see in this video, taken from the same screenshot, same setup that we had earlier, Blade vaulting off of the car, and notice how both the hunter and all of the enemies kind of just smoothly move out of the way when the camera's on Blade so that he has a spot to land. As a player, you can focus on selecting Blade, selecting the target that you want, and everything else is handled for you. So with all of those fixes and modifications and additional mechanics, did it work? How did we do with resolving the tension between those systems? Ultimately, yeah, it worked really well. We trusted our instincts and stuck to that core feeling we wanted for our players, but knew we needed some more time to reduce the tension between these systems. Each one felt so good in isolation and a right fit for the game and the overall player experience, we stuck with them and trusted that we could find ways to help them complement each other. It took a lot of time and effort and iteration to massage them into a good place, but in the final game, this tension largely goes unnoticed. We knew we had succeeded when our playtest feedback didn't mention movement or positioning, but instead focused on how lining up enemies for knockback felt amazing, or how it was really satisfying to use an environment attack to trigger an explosion and take out a bunch of enemies. To summarize the takeaway here, It's OK to trust your gut when you feel confident in your systems and how they are satisfying your core and enhancing your game loops, even if there is some fundamental tension between them. Now, it won't be easy, and it will take time and effort to minimize or hide that tension so players don't notice it. But it is better to trust your instincts and get to work if you really know that the game will be better with those systems in place than without them. OK, on to our final area of tactical combat design, our resources. Resources in tactical combat are used to control how many actions a player can take at a given time and what actions they have available. We've already talked about the what here. That's handled by our card system for the hero abilities. As for the how many, games use different terms for the primary resource, but common ones are energy, mana, or action points. During prototyping, when we were still figuring out the basics of the combat system, we started with energy and had a big choice to make about how to distribute and allocate both energy and abilities across all of our heroes. There are two main axes here for each of these questions. First, should heroes have individual energy that they can spend independently? Or should the squad as a team and the full group have a shared energy pool? And second, should each hero have their own isolated set of abilities that they can use on their turn? Or should the squad have a shared pool of abilities? So that leaves us with 4 different combinations to look at as possible solutions to this problem. First up, individual abilities and individual energy. This is the XCOM model, the Dungeons and Dragons model. Every character has their own set of things that they can do each turn, and their own set of resources with which to do those things. There is a lot of capability every turn if you have multiple characters, such as XCOM, where you can have a squad of 6 soldiers with 2 action points each. That's 12 total actions every turn. The action economy here is very high. And this is how we started, since it worked great for XCOM. However, when we shifted over to the card system, it became less appealing. Each turn, you would need to look at a hero, see what random abilities they had available for the turn, and then determine how best to spend their individual energy. That's not terrible for a single character, but once you expand the decision space for multiple heroes, it can be a lot to manage. In XCOM, you always have certainty that each soldier has a set of common abilities like shoot, overwatch, and reload that are available every turn as actions. So the overhead for managing multiple characters in your squad is reduced. XCOM's soldier classes are also shared across multiple units, so there's more familiarity on the whole from soldier to soldier. When every hero is instead drawing a randomized set of abilities every turn, and they are all totally unique for each hero character, that ends up being a lot more mental overhead when trying to plan out your turn. This is also one of the reasons that we dropped the squad size down to 3 heroes instead of the 4 soldiers that we started with in XCOM, and kept that number of 3 heroes consistent for the entire game. So once we started feeling really good about using the card system to represent our abilities, we knew we needed to move past this model and start looking at our other options. The next option we tried was individual abilities. So every hero still has their own unique kind of set of cards that they'll pull from for their individual hand each turn. But now we have an energy pool that is shared across the squad to perform actions. Instead of having 3 heroes with 2 energy each, we now take that energy and make it a shared pool of 6 to be used by whichever characters the player wants. This ends up not working out great, since it actually increases the decision space and the complexity even more. Instead of focusing on an individual character one at a time and determining how to spend their energy with their abilities, there's now even more of a burden on the player to understand every hero's possible actions before committing to spend your shared energy. And I have so many characters, and their abilities are different and randomized every turn. This approach can also lead to a feast or famine play pattern, where a single character can feast and dominate by consuming all of the energy, while the other heroes sit around with nothing to do. For example, with a hero like the Hulk on the board, who just deals more damage than the other characters, it was very easy to just use him for all 6 energy for every action, since he was simply more powerful. And that's not good. We want the heroes to feel like a team and give everyone a chance to shine in combat. Now, there is a way to reduce the complexity space here, and that's by reducing the amount of actions that you have in the pool, reduce the number of energy. Card Hunter is a great example of a game which does this well by reducing that available energy all the way down to 1. You still have many actions available. It's a large decision space, but they put everything on the screen in front of you at one time, so you always have the full scope and context. And each time you need to make a decision, you're only making a single choice. What am I going to do right now? What is the singular card that I'm going to play next? It's still not an ideal solution for us, since we felt like heroes should be able to take multiple actions per turn, and we wanted players to be able to develop a bit more of a medium-term plan for sequencing multiple actions together and allowing heroes to combo on a single turn. The reverse approach for our third option is to introduce a shared set of abilities to select from each turn, but each character still has their individual energy. We used this approach for a while. Shared abilities is a natural evolution of using a card and a deck system, since you could take the individual abilities from every hero and shuffle them all together to form a single deck that you then draw from for your hand of abilities every turn. Then my options for all of my heroes are very clear. But this can lead to a similar feast or famine problem, be more on the famine side this time, since we could end up having a ton of cards in our hand for a single hero, and then the other characters don't have a way to spend their individual energy. Leaving resources unspent at the end of a turn never feels good as a player. It's basically the game saying, too bad, you could do more, you have the resources to do more, but we're not going to let you right now. So that's not great. We tried to mitigate this famine problem by giving every hero a built-in default ability which they could use for 1 energy. OK, great. Now, if they always have a way to consume any excess energy that they didn't get to spend from the cards in the hand, that solves the famine problem. But giving every hero an ability, which they always have available, creates a tricky balance problem because it dilutes the importance of the ability cards in your hand. If the default ability is good enough, then you could essentially just ignore what's in your hand, or those ability cards in your hand would need to become so overly powerful to compensate. So while this did solve our famine problem, it really skewed the power level of every ability in the game upward in a way that we weren't comfortable with. OK, on to our last option here, our final combination, shared abilities, which we know from the last option works really great with our card system, and going back to a shared energy system. Now we have a set of contained, interesting choices in deciding how I'm going to play my hand each turn. We also have a shared energy pool, which removes the tension of which hero can do what and eliminates our feast or famine problem. The player can be in a single headspace of looking at their hand of cards, knowing they can choose to play some of them, and then strategize to plan their turn from there. Now, theoretically, yes, you could still have turns where you don't have cards for a specific hero, so they don't get to do anything. But that is now purely based on the randomness of the cards that you draw, rather than resource excess or limitations, so it isn't really something that you feel as a player. You don't feel that restriction. We also have opportunities for characters to act on their turn, even if you don't have any of their cards in your hand, such as using environment attacks. So obviously, this final option was our winner and the method that we stuck with for Midnight Suns. The takeaway here is to explore all of the options. It's always beneficial to check all the possible paths, since you never know what might end up being the best fit for your game. Ideally, you'll have a set of tools built into your engine for the game which lets you quickly toggle and manipulate the rules and values, so it's easy to explore and experiment and try out all of the combinations, and then isolate the approach which really feels the best. OK, great. We now have our default ability distribution and our action economy system established. Turn to turn, we're feeling good about the abilities that we have available and the resources that we have to play them. But there's still another problem that we need to solve. What is stopping me as a player from always choosing to do the coolest possible thing that I have available? We need a way to scale ability cost. and provide some limitations on which abilities the player can choose to use so we can have abilities at varying power levels. We needed something which makes players say, I can't do this right now, or I really shouldn't do this right now. I need to maybe save this for later. In XCOM, this tension and limitation comes from movement and positioning. You need to move to try to line up your shots, have line of sight on your targets. But movement and line of sight aren't concerns in Midnight Suns. You can always see all of the possible targets, and remember that if you click on a target, the hero will just automatically move to perform the action. So we need another form of limitation. We have two approaches to this. We could very simply increase the amount of energy a card costs. So instead of costing 1 energy, it could cost 2 or 3 or 4 or more. This is the approach used by most trading card games, and it works great if you have a scaling resource system where the amount of your available primary resource like energy grows over time. It can provide a good amount of tension. Do I spend a higher amount of energy to play a stronger ability now, or play multiple smaller abilities? It can absolutely work, but we had a few restrictions which we discovered during our playtests. We really wanted the number of actions available to players each turn to be relatively low, and we wanted to avoid expanding and increasing that number over time if we could, since it could lead to much longer turns and challenges for hero progression. And we really wanted the combat missions, to feel pretty snappy. We also knew that we didn't want to become a full-fledged deck-building trading card game, and we wanted to keep the number of abilities per hero relatively low. So our options to scale energy on a wide margin and have enough cards at each of those energy values was limited. We explored another option. What if we introduce a secondary limiting resource? But wait, you might say, this is more complex. We will need a way to generate the secondary resource and then to determine how we're going to spend it. We'll have to balance 2 different resource systems, both energy and this secondary resource. Isn't that additional complexity going to be bad? Well, we tried it out, and after testing the secondary resource, which we called heroism, we really liked the flexibility that it gave us. We could have some cards generate heroism, and others could spend it. And that gives us some great resource balance knobs to turn for each card. They could either generate or cost more or less heroism. In fact, we felt so good about what heroism as a secondary resource gave us as a mechanic that we looked back at energy to see if we could reduce its complexity to compensate. Now, in the final game, energy does not exist on cards in Midnight Suns. Instead, our primary resource is card plays. It explicitly indicates the number of cards that you can play from your hand per turn, and every card costs 1 card play. That's it. Nice and simple. We don't even have to indicate it on the card because the cards themselves are the resource. Heroism then becomes the pseudo-primary resource that you actually notice on cards. Either it generates heroism or spends it, and the heroism cost can scale from 0 to 10, which is the heroism cap. This gives players a fun decision space of choosing how to generate heroism and when to spend it. There are 2 more things we need to consider with the addition of heroism. The first is creating a reliable way for players to generate it. We found in our early testing that having ability cards which are guaranteed to generate heroism is an obvious requirement, but generating 1 heroism at a time could be slow, taking multiple turns to build up enough heroism before getting to unleash your bigger attacks. One way we mitigated this was by allowing certain cards, or skill cards, to generate 2 heroism, while attack cards can only generate 1 heroism. This had the added benefit of boosting the value of skill cards, since they can have a hard time competing with cards that deal direct damage to enemies. Another way we improved the heroism economy is through the introduction of minion enemies and the quick keyword mechanic. Minions are enemies which are defeated after receiving any damage. They are one-hit KOs. We didn't want every encounter in the game to feel like this long, drawn-out, epic clash between hero and supervillain. It's very satisfying and part of that hero power fantasy to take out a bunch of weaker bad guys without breaking a sweat. Aside from being fun to throw around and good for applying some small damage pressure to players, minions also ended up serving as a pseudo-heroism resource when we introduced the quick keyword on some of our ability cards. Quick makes the ability refund a card play if it KOs an enemy. Since Quick most frequently appears on attack cards, which generate heroism, using an attack card to KO a minion ends up acting as a free card play and a way for players to generate additional heroism per turn. So in the final game, you'll notice that almost every single mission will include minions as a constant backfill and set of reinforcements because they essentially can function as a heroism generator when comboed with the Quick ability cards. The final mechanic we needed to add in response to introducing heroism was a way to manage your hand by removing powerful, high-cost heroism cards which you have no way to play. You could end up in a pretty rough situation where your entire hand is filled with heroic cards, but you have no way to generate any heroism to actually be able to play them. You could basically be stuck and have nothing to do on a given turn. Feels really bad. Redraw is a simple card-based mechanic that we added to help mitigate this problem, which allows you to discard a card from your hand and immediately draw a new one to replace it. It's a simple tool, but it gives players some options every turn to remove undesirable cards and helps prevent the hand from getting filled with unplayable cards turn over turn. We also did some massaging under the hood to ensure that if your entire hand of cards cannot be played, when you redraw, you are guaranteed to draw a card which you can play, even if it wasn't technically at the top of the deck. In edge cases like this, we've found it totally acceptable to subtly tweak the rules of the game to ensure a positive player experience in getting them unstuck from a really negative situation. It's a bit specific, but let's use that as a takeaway. We'll bend the rules to avoid the worst possible outcomes. Just do it in a way which is invisible to players. If you are debating breaking the rules or leaving a frustrating situation in the game which may cause players to rage quit, it's OK to break the rules. Games are full of these subtle, soft nudges to ensure that players are having a good time. Even in a strategy or tactics game which runs on a very strict rule set, the ultimate goal at the end of the day for everything that we do is to ensure that our players are having fun. OK. That covers it. We've gone through all the major elements of combat design in Marvel's Midnight Suns, taking a look at the design evolution, which led to us using cards to represent our hero abilities, the inherent tension that we had to accept with our movement and positioning systems, and building up the resource economy to create an interesting decision space for our players. It's interesting to note that each of these systems and decisions required the previous one to take shape. We started with the core pillar and the simplest possible version of our game for our initial prototype. As part of refining our smallest combat game loop of using our hero abilities, we knew we wanted heroes to auto-move as part of using those abilities, which in turn directly impacted our knockback and environment attack systems. Iterating on the game loops also helped us to determine that the card system was correct for representing our hero abilities. That led to our decision on which resources to use and the creation of heroism as a secondary resource, and that required the introduction of redraws and relying on minions. We started simple, and rather than forcing a ton of mechanics or systems into the game at the very start, the complexity of the game grew naturally over time as we looked to solve the next problem in front of us. It's also exciting to see the potential for interesting hero designs which can now be built on top of these systems. I could probably fill an entire second talk just deep diving on each individual hero, but to give a few very quick examples. While nearly every hero in the game uses knockback, Magic is entirely built around repositioning enemies using her portals as hand-placed knockback conduits. Spider-Man is really effective at using environment attacks and provides extra moves to the team for increased mobility and easier positioning. Iron Man uses the redraw mechanic in a really greedy way by consuming redraws to boost the power of his own personal cards. And Doctor Strange's abilities will flexibly scale up and down in power to become enhanced based on your current heroism value. So it's entirely driven by that secondary resource. None of these hero mechanics could exist without allowing the underlying systems to grow out of our core pillar initial prototype, and our simple game loop. To recap, let's go through each of the takeaways we generated one more time. First, identify the core of your game and use it as the North Star which guides all of your other decisions. Second, start with simple loops which connect to that core and ensure that the most fundamental piece of your game, the one that you'll do 1,000,000 times, feels satisfying. Next, find the systems which are the right fit for your game, even if they're unconventional. It's also important to trust your gut with mechanics and designs which feel great, but may have some tension or complications. Just be prepared to put in the work to reduce that friction as much as possible. Don't forget to explore all the options, especially when you have mechanics on clear axes, since you never know what you might find or realize from those playtests and that experimentation. And don't worry, it's OK to secretly bend the rules to avoid those rage quit moments. Just keep that between us, OK? Don't tell the players. They don't need to know. And finally, if there is one takeaway to rule them all, it is to start simple and let your design evolve from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. We have some time for Q&A, so any questions, please raise your hands, and we will have a mic over to you.
While we're getting the mic set up, just real quick, I'd like to say, presentations like this can make it seem like I was the person driving all of these decisions and did the whole design myself. I did not. It was a very, very large team over many years of prototyping and iteration. So just a quick shout out, thank you to the entire Midnight Suns team, everyone who worked on the game, supported me in the role, everyone at 2K, Firaxis, Marvel, Take-Two was great. And a quick shout out to my coworkers who gave me feedback on the talk, and to Peter Smith, who did the slide background and template. And also, please scan the QR code and fill out the survey on the talk.
OK, so we'll start from the back. Any questions?
Hi, Joe.
Yeah. Hello.
Really great talk. I really enjoyed. So my question is, when I play a game like Slay the Spire, I really enjoy the aspect of how your relics and your cards play against each other with different builds. So I'm assuming here your different heroes have different abilities that work well with each other. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you went about that?
Yeah, so the hero abilities interacting with one another, we really tried to isolate every hero's design to make them interesting. So we either took a very strong thematic element of every hero, if their superpowers were very clear that we could build a full game mechanic out of. So for example, Magic was one of the examples I showed. Her mutant superpowers to create these portals. So you're like, OK, great. Her core ability mechanic just has to be portals. For other heroes, like, great, Captain America is going to be a protector. He's going to have more tanky abilities and gain block and defend himself and other heroes from attacks. We didn't do a ton of explicit design work to try and create combinations. We really focused on design each hero mostly independently to be really interesting and kind of synergize with themselves and feel powerful. And then just through kind of utilizing the mechanics and putting every hero on a different axis and giving each of them something different and unique to do, when you put them in combat together, the combinations just sort of, it was kind of a emergent design, which was really lucky, I guess, for us, but also really fun, where it's like we felt confident in the individual heroes feeling fun to play and powerful, and then we're able to, throwing them into a squad with one another resulted in a lot of really fun combinations.
Let's do with you. We have some time, so I imagine a lot of you have questions. We'll go through.
So I wanted to ask, different characters have different abilities, and they affect positioning, environmental effects, and all that. So how do you go about balancing them, especially since how do you measure positioning and its effects?
Positioning and balancing the positioning abilities of the heroes and how we balance that. So we were able to, once we introduced movement as kind of its own separate resource, so the move resource, you had one per turn that any of the heroes could use, that became something that we could manipulate, and that would let you either like increase or decrease the general like movement flexibility that we had with the characters. It was, yeah, kind of like going back to the tension just in those systems. It wasn't something that we really could explicitly balance around. We just looked to have the movement interactions on enough hero abilities that they felt, like a core part of the game. So almost every hero has at least one ability that does knockback. There's kind of a second level ability called shove that you can use to spend a move resource to not use it as a knockback on an enemy. So there were a couple different ways that we pulled the movement and the positioning gameplay into the rest of the hero abilities so it felt integrated. But it was always kind of a secondary level of tactics and strategic decision making compared to the core of just playing the ability cards from your hand, and then the movement was kind of the second order decision space that you would put your head into. So if you were a completely new player and you never wanted to think about movement or positioning, you could play the game just by playing cards from your hand, picking targets, and everything would work. And that was one of our goals for approachability for the game as well.
Hi, Joe. So you mentioned in the talk about making games more complicated. Like you're worried about whatever new things you introduce, whatever new design elements, whatever new mechanics and stuff. The risk of making it more complicated to the player to understand is a huge risk, right? And my question to you is, how do you tutorialize a lot of the things that you already implemented in it, and what goes into your head when you're designing tutorials for so many complex mechanics already before even adding on more or something?
Sure. Playtesting is a huge part of it. Just playing your game, having other people play your game and seeing how they respond. If a player is sitting down with your prototype and doesn't understand the rules, that could be a sign that you either need to tutorialize them better, or I guess I should say, if you have a prototype set up and you put a lot of work into the tutorial and trying to explain all the mechanics, and players just don't feel like they're using all of the resources that you have available, if they're not engaging with mechanics or systems, that's probably a sign that things are too complicated. I guess from what I was saying with the talk, I'm not trying to imply that complexity in games is inherently bad. I mean, you need complexity. We make very, very complicated games that have a lot of tactical, strategic, decision-making, mechanics, rule sets. All of that is very core to the experience. It's making sure that the foundational pieces are as simple as possible and that those can be fun. There's some inherent degree of complexity that is going to come from any game system. You still have to understand, I need to move my mouse and click on the thing and click on the target and then watch it execute. But making sure that can be understood and that players get it and feel like it's fun and exciting, that's then a good sign of when you can layer things on top. But at a point, it just kind of comes down to feel and watching your players and seeing what systems they are engaging with and making sure that if they are using kind of the full scope of the systems in the game and everything is kind of firing on all cylinders, then that's probably a sign that you're at a good level of complexity. If there are systems that players are just kind of completely ignoring, then maybe they're extraneous, or they need to be simplified a little bit more to get them integrated with the rest of the game mechanics.
Yeah, hi. Everyone, we'll just take one last question so we can go for the next speaker. Thank you.
So, hi. Okay. Hi, I wanted to ask, you're working with a huge IP like Marvel, so there is a lore that already exists, right? So there is always a power difference. For example, in the characters that you are going to include, right? So there's going to be Hulk, who is super strong, and then there's always going to be some other characters who are a little weaker. So how do you balance, their moves and everything? Because players are expecting something from a character like, let's say, Hulk,
Sure.
that makes a huge impact on things, and then there is weaker characters like Hawkeye or something So how do you balance the expectation and the currency that you're using? So how do you balance everything?
Yeah, so at a certain point with the Marvel superheroes, we did have to kind of say and be like, well, it's a video game. They all need rules, and we can't let the Hulk deal infinite damage. Or like, yeah, canonically, the Hulk can't die, but like we need a way for heroes to be able to get knocked out in combat so you can lose missions. There are certain things that we just had to kind of accept of, yep, it's a video game. We need to have certain things here that are going to not completely line up with the canon of the characters. But we tried by using the different resources, the mechanics that we built up. So Hulk, for example, in the game, a lot of his cards are very, very high heroism costs. So he almost needs to be paired with another hero that can generate a lot of heroism in order to feed his abilities. So there are, that's one example. And then like because his abilities are highly, have a high heroism cost, we can then afford to make them a little bit more powerful, where they can affect more enemies. He has a lot of AoE attacks. He can stun enemies a lot. He has a lot of knockback. But it's finding mechanical ways using our gameplay systems to either restrict or kind of free the different characters from those, from those restrictions, so that they still feel like they resonate with who that character is and feel still balanced. But with a character like Hulk, he was an extreme example where he unlocks very late in the game, and we were okay with him being a little bit overpowered and a little bit broken because he was this, it's the Hulk, and he's this big end game reward. But yeah, we want every hero to feel powerful kind of in their own unique way. So we tried to make their mechanics and abilities feel separate so that they could all feel kind of independently powerful, and then let the player decide which combinations they felt most excited about pursuing. All right. Well, thank you all very much.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Joe. Can we have another round of applause just for Joe? Thank you so much for coming to IGDC.